We're in the final decade of George Harrison's life, and there's quite a few events to discuss. Shortly after the release of Wilburys 3, George was persuaded by Eric Clapton to tour Japan with his own band. The last time George had toured, even done a full-length solo show, was 1974, but he had performed on stage since then a few times. He joined a live tribute to Carl Perkins in 1985. 1986, he performed at the Birmingham Heartbeat charity concert, and 1987 is when he took the stage for the Prince's Trust concert, where he performed Here Comes the Sun, With a Little Help from My Friends with Ringo, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Still my guitar gently weeps.
Once again, Eric played the famous solo, this time without the heroine. Planning to share the spotlight with Eric, not having to be the lone star up front, probably gave George the confidence to tour again.
And the reason we came to Japan was because he likes Japan.
They still have a very serious attitude towards music and the arts.
It's also worth noting that this was shortly after Eric had tragically lost his son Connor, so it was probably good on his end to perform with his friend. The concerts took place in December 1991, in many of the same cities I played with Let It Be.
They shelled out up to $75 a ticket to see two rock legends.
And a double CD was released the following year to great acclaim. Live in Japan is a worthy addition to George's long-spanning catalog. Again, I'm not going to include it in the main lineup of rating his solo albums, but we can still talk about it here. He would begin each show with I Wanna Tell You, which really imagine going to see George Harrison live and seeing him open with a Beatles song, one from Revolver, not to mention dishing out a slide solo in the middle of the tune, followed by another guitar solo from Eric Clapton. Man, if I had seen that when I was a kid, my mind would have been blown. He does quite a few Beatles songs, many of which have extended solos from Eric. I really like that these songs are different. They didn't just copy the tracks to a T.
There is an element of spontaneity.
The extended jams are fun, some of George's vocal riffs are a nice touch. It feels like you're just hanging out watching a jam session with George and his friends. We actually looked to this album for references in the Something Show for endings and extended jams. Of course, he also plays many of his classic solo hits. Some from All Things Must Pass, along with Gimme Love, Dark Horse, All Those Years Ago, and a few songs from Cloud 9. There is an essential new George song on this album called Cheer Down, which originally played over the closing credits for Lethal Weapon 2.
It's just been revoked.
That slide solo on the vamp is my favorite one George ever played in his career. Actually, Todd mentioned to me that he's a big fan of this record, so I'm gonna let him speak a little more about it. Over to you, Todd.
Alright, so let me just preface this by saying that I'm kind of a sucker for live albums by my favorite artists. Well, George, Eric, and the rest of the band do not disappoint. See, whenever I get a new album, I don't like to look at the track listing. I like to pop on my headphones and imagine I'm really at the concert and think to myself, what are they going to open with? What are they going to play? And George pleasantly surprised me by performing a couple lesser-known Beatles tunes to open the album. I Want to Tell You proved to be a great opener. Then, he follows it up with Old Brown Shoe, a B-side that I always forget about.
You may comfort me.
On Taxman, he gets some fun new lyrical content, George getting a little political about the Gulf War. Piggies is another surprise, one that I probably wouldn't have picked, but he gives us some fun new lyrical content in that song as well. Well, a big favorite of mine is Cloud 9. Man, I love hearing George and Eric go back and forth on lead guitar on this one. It's a very groovy tune. Vocally, you can tell George is a little bit rusty, or perhaps he's saving his voice in the beginning, but he really lets loose towards the end. You can tell he's having a lot of fun performing Devil's Radio. Then the album really culminates with the soulful performances of Isn't It a Pity and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I give the album a goldfish. I appreciate that he was bold enough to release a live album rather than kind of just putting together a greatest hits album or anthology or something like that. It was much more fun to hear some new takes on some classic tunes in front of a live audience.
There's a neat video of Devil's Radio on YouTube, though it kinda makes me wonder why this entire concert has never gotten a full DVD or Blu-ray release. Seriously, I would totally buy that on any platform. I have heard a few outtakes from these concerts, like Fish on the Sand, Love Comes to Everyone, and on every concert, Eric would do a short set of his songs while George took a break, many of which were written about Patty, bringing this whole love triangle full circle. Actually, my biggest disappointment, which isn't on the album, is why George didn't come out to play the famous bridge guitar part on Badge, which he originally wrote. I'm also curious as to why him and Eric didn't do Run So Far, a song they both performed together on Eric's Journeyman album. Still, the Japan tour was a huge success.
Possibly I'll do a few shows here and there over the next year or two.
George would perform another show at the Royal Albert Hall in 1992 without Eric Clapton, and it would be his final full-length concert. He did have a semi-Wilburys reunion with Bob Dylan and Tom Petty at the end of the year. And earlier in 1992, he performed a cover with Jools Holland of an old Cab Calloway song called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. This would eventually appear on Brainwashed. But it was in 1993 when the absolute peak of George's career occurred, possibly the greatest thrill of his life.
Hello, Homer. I'm George Harrison.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Where did you get that brownie?
Over there's a big pile of them.
Yep, George Harrison was on The Simpsons. Boy, it kind of goes to show you just how long that show's been on the air. And it wasn't just any Simpsons episode, it was Homer's Barbershop Quartet, where Homer's band, the B Sharps, was a parody of the Beatles' career. George even got to poke some fun at it.
It's been done.
Actually, here's a fun fact, one that I told the press many times while I was with Let It Be. This Simpsons episode was my introduction to the Beatles. I was a kid when I saw this episode, and my dad was the one who explained a lot of the references I didn't get.
Number 8. Number 8.
Suddenly I found myself to be a big Beatles fan, at a time when most of my friends didn't even know who they were. So you can imagine my excitement when I found out there was going to be a new anthology set of CDs and documentary, including 2 new Beatles songs. Yep. 25 years after countless attempts to reform the Beatles, all in vain, Paul, George, and Ringo got together to finish 2 demos that John Lennon had never released. At George's insistence, they brought in Jeff Lynne as producer to salvage the cassette tape for Free as a Bird. And bear in mind, this was 1994. There wasn't an endless supply of software and plugins that could salvage this recording.
Technically, it was virtually impossible to do it. But we did it, you know.
Right at the top, following a classic Ringo drum fill, George's slide introduces the song, and it's such a sublime sound. Likewise, the joining together of Paul, George, and John's voices. It's one of the few tracks to be credited to all 4 of them since John left the song unfinished.
We added parts and we wrote lyrics.
George sings the second bridge, which ascends into a slide solo. The final part of the tune, which is so Beatles, ends with a ukulele played by George with a backwards spoken track by John. Yeah, in case you haven't realized by now, George was a little bit obsessed with ukuleles. They would dig up another tune of John's, Real Love. George plays some nice licks on that one as well. Supposedly he performed some licks on some other unfinished John demos, but they've never been released. I've heard that one of the reasons George did the Anthology project was because he was in need of money due to the mismanagement from his former manager, Dennis O'Brien. This is partially why his follow-up solo record to Cloud 9 kept getting derailed.
Just a George Harrison album I will do maybe end of next year.
Along with the Anthology and working on another album with Ravi Shankar called Chants of India. In fact, while promoting Ravi's new album, George took a few spontaneous requests on VH1, including a brand new song called Any Road.
Ah, yeah, you pay your fare, and if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
This would also include his final televised performance of All Things Must Pass.
All things must pass away.
Pretty fitting for his final performance. In 1997, George was diagnosed with lung cancer, which I'm sure some of you know already if you've had to do any sort of school paper on the dangers of smoking. He was undergoing treatment, and it looked like he was in the clear while he continued work on his long-delayed solo album and contribute to other artists' records.
I mean, we're all going to die one day, but I'm not going to die for you quite yet.
I still remember this day, December 30th, 1999, when George was stabbed in his own home.
Former Beatle George Harrison is in a hospital after being stabbed by an assailant several times in the chest.
And for many fans still haunted by the death of John Lennon, old and young alike, this was a scary report to hear about. Fortunately, George survived, but it had to have taken years off his life. In 2000, with the re-release of All Things Must Pass, which would actually be my first time listening to the album, George retooled My Sweet Lord with a new slide solo, new vocal, Sam Brown singing vocals, and Danny Harrison playing an acoustic. Kind of fun to listen to him mess with it 30 years later, but it can't compare to the original recording. In 2001, the cancer he thought had been treated had spread to his brain. It was at this point we all knew things were dire. So George, with the help of his son Danny, focused on finishing his album. But it got to a point where he was just too weak to keep working on it. He recorded his last vocal for Jools Holland's Horse to the Water, co-written with Danny, and you can tell his voice is going. On November 29th, 2001, George Harrison died at the age of 58. I remember this day very well, my parents lighting candles and listening to the White Album. Considering this was only a couple months after 9/11, it was an extremely depressing time.
Everything passes except the essence of that which is our soul.
Probably the best tribute to him was the fantastic concert for George, organized by Olivia, Danny, and Eric Clapton. Many of George's best-known songs were performed by Eric, Danny, Jeff Lynne, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Even Monty Python did a performance of the Lumberjack song. My favorite performance was actually Billy Preston singing My Sweet Lord, which showed just what a powerful song it was. And finally, in late 2002, his long-awaited album was finally released, Brainwashed. Join me in the next video and we're going to discuss the final album in George Harrison's album reviews.